Labor Day parade, and yet nobody heard a thing.
Hey, stand down. You know. Come on, guys. All right. So now we're going to start. And so on September the 7th, 1903, just 4 months before the sensational murder of Bedford teacher Sarah Schaefer, a 53-year-old seamstress named Susannah Ireland died here in an upstairs apartment. So she would have been in an apartment building that was right over here. Mrs. Rippon.
Oh, isn't it awful? Everybody was at the Labor Day parade, and yet nobody heard a thing.
Hello. Could you tell us what you knew about the death of Mrs. Ireland?
Well, my name is Mrs. Rippey. My husband and I run a hotel over there. Just after the Labor Day parade, Cora Weeks came running out to tell me that her mother had killed herself up here on the second floor of the O'Connell building. So I ran over, and sure enough, poor Mrs. Ireland is laying there dead. It just seemed very odd.
Kind of strange. What do you think then?
Well, first of all, she was lying flat, that somebody would fall that way. Her arms were across her chest with the gun in her right hand. And the weird thing is, there was no blood anywhere.
Good God, woman, stop gossiping. And leave this inquiry to the professionals.
Don't you talk to me like that. If you'd done half your job, the person who killed Mrs. Ireland would be in jail right now.
Now, Mrs. Rippey, hold on. There's no reason to insult each other. We'd like to hear from the gentleman if we could. And that is if you're finished, Mrs. Rippey. Mr. Rippey, could you tell us?
Richard Plummer, County Coroner. Now, I marched with General Sherman to the Atlantic in the War of the Rebellion. And I was at the site of Mrs. Ireland's death in less than 20 minutes. And I held an inquest. And it was my professional opinion that Mrs. Ireland had committed suicide, as her daughter had originally said. Mrs. Weeks said that her mother committed suicide. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Weeks both indicated that Mrs. Ireland had been despondent for a month or more, and her health was deteriorating, and she had expressed suicidal intent.
So obviously Mrs. Rippey was thinking about the position of the body. What did you think about the position of the body?
The position of the body seemed consistent with the verdict of suicide.
Thank you.
I've said my piece.
Yeah.
Shut up, woman.
You know, Mr. Plummer here is a perfect example of why it's no longer safe for women to live in Lawrence County.
Excuse me.
I think we're having to agree to disagree. I'm sorry I called you by the wrong name. I apologize for that.
Yeah, I wouldn't marry him.
It's all good.
Hardy, hardy, hard.
And so, as of today, when we're here recounting this, the building isn't actually standing that actually you owned. It was over here, just
Right.
to be clear. And
Mrs. Rippey, the bar.
Mrs. Ireland.
Mrs. Ireland,
Her window
yeah.
was up there.
Right here.
okay. So we'll just have to put that in our minds. I thank you so much, and we'll start walking this way.
So I have a question.
Sure.
Anybody answer why there's no blood?
No. None that I've seen.
They cleaned it up well.
Yeah, we've seen people that's fingers around cold, but I don't know about no blood. Yeah, so
She was shot in the back of the head.
Somebody
Oh, she was shot in the back of the head.
Yes, with the gun in her hand. No
The
blood.
barrel of the gun was 2 inches long, and it was.
So she
there
didn't
was
exactly
no powder
crawl there.
burns.
No.
So, and she was shot from the right back side, and it came out this way. Well,
Right-handed or left-handed?
right-handed. There's no way. Yeah, I mean, I have little hands, so there was no contact powder burn. So,
Powder burn. You said when she fell backwards on her back or on face down?
This is how
They found her on her
this
back.
is how they found her.
No idea where she really was shot.
Like that, with her arms crossed and then pistol in one hand.
If you actually commit suicide, put a
1903.
gun to your hand.
The
And
Sarah Schaefer murder
no matter
was like
what,
4 months
it's
after.
gonna, the blowback, you're not gonna land on your back with your arms crossed. Your gun is gonna be
Mrs. Rip, you're not professional. Please, let's move on.
That's what I told her.
You're to do your job.
Well, those two seem very nice, but there's some gentlemen here that might be able to shed a little more light on the controversial story. Let's meet.
I am Eli Stevenson, Deputy Prosecutor.
Eli Stevenson, of course. I think you were involved with the investigation of the Sarah Schaefer murder.
Correct. That was a few months after this one. The prosecutor at the time was Simpson Lowe. You may remember him. He lived over there.
There was a house here?
Yeah, right behind that extension office. Simpson Lowe, I think we can all remember him, especially as he relates to the Sarah Schaefer murder. But we are talking about Susannah Ireland today. So, what do you have on that case?
Well, despite my enormous respect for Coroner Plummer, there are a few things about the death of Susannah Ireland that I don't feel were consistent with the verdict of suicide. First, Mrs. Ireland was shot right side of her head. Bullet exited over her right eye. There were no powder burns on her hair or scalp. Second, as I'm sure you've heard from Mrs. Rippey, Mrs. Ireland was found lying on her back, her hands folded on her chest. The .32 caliber revolver was in her right hand. Her forefinger was on the trigger. The barrel of the gun was 2.5 inches long. Shooting this weapon in this position, Mrs. Ireland would have had to press the muzzle to her scalp to steady it, which would have left powder burns. The recoil from the pistol would have thrown it from her hands. Also, there was no blood on the carpet. We took Mrs. Ireland's body to Hodge and Ferguson's undertaking over there on the square, and Doctors Stipp, Emery, Freeland, Short, and Duncan all examined her body and determined that she could not have shot herself in that fashion. She was shot from behind.
With all due respect, Mr. Stevenson, let me take it from here. The name's James Myers, Bedford City Police Department. The day after the murder, I went to the Weeks apartment in the O'Connell building, and the one they shared with the victim, and I arrested Joseph and Cora Weeks. Funny, to get to the apartment, I had to go through the Ingalls saloon, go through a side door to get to the stairwell.
So you're saying that the murderer probably had to go through the side door of the saloon to access the apartment?
Correct. Mrs. Weeks was quite surprised to see us. She asked who was pushing this investigation, why she'd want to even kill her mother. I didn't have any answers for her. I was just doing my job.
So, Mr. Myers, I guess the question would be, did anyone talk to the owner of the saloon? And did they know if anybody had entered the stairwell or exited the apartment building?
Not to my knowledge.
Oh. Well, thank you both. We do appreciate it. You've given us lots to think about. We're just go meet a few other folks along our way, but we do appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
All right, let's go on. Let's go learn a little bit more. Are you starting to piece it together, friends? Miss, I hate to bother you, but you look very distraught.
I am distraught. Poor Mrs. Ireland has been murdered, and her daughter and son-in-law have been arrested. When everyone in the neighborhood knows who did it, and it wasn't them.
Well, we're listening. Tell us.
My name is Mrs. Wheeler, and I live nearby. I saw Mrs. Ireland every day sitting in her window, sewing. She worked hard to help her daughter and son-in-law pay expenses.
And
Her window looks out on the alleyway, see, facing west. And she could see all the goings-on behind the place of our so-called prosecutor, Simpson Lowe.
yes, and
Everyone knows that Simpson Lowe was up to his elbows in evil and intimidation. Mrs. Ireland saw something. Lowe sent someone to kill her, shot her in the back of the head, and then tried to act like she did it herself. When that didn't work, they blamed her poor daughter and son-in-law.
do you happen to have any proof of this?
Poor Cora Weeks. She lost her little girl and lost her mom, and now she and her husband are in jail. They spent their last dime to bury Mrs. Ireland. She couldn't even go to the burial. And everyone in the whole neighborhood can hear her screaming up in her cell on the second floor.
Oh, sounds very unpleasant for the whole neighborhood. We do thank you, though, for your time.
Thank you.
What do you think about this, sir?
Alexander's my name. They call me around here Captain Alexander.
Captain Alexander, aren't you the last person to see Sarah Schaefer alive?
Same. I was the backup pauper attorney, and the court appointed me to represent Mrs. Weeks in October 1903. Her husband's family hired Zering and Pugh to represent him.
They didn't pay to represent Cora as well?
Well, legal defense is very expensive. By the time her trial rolled around in December 1903, she was very pale and haggard. Jury came back with a not guilty verdict, or with a verdict that they couldn't decide whether she was guilty or not guilty. Hung jury. So the court reset the trial for February 1904. By the time the second trial rolled around, the town was sick and tired of the murders. There'd been a second murder of a lady named Sarah Schaefer, and the rumors were real thick that local elected officials were involved in that.
We understand. Thank you for your time and your insights. We appreciate
You're welcome. My pleasure.
it. Leave. First of all, Miss Indiana, our statue right here. She's 100 years old next month. They're going to have a birthday party for Miss Indiana. It'll be on Monday, November the 27th. Please be sure and join us. She was carved here in Bedford, Indiana. So you can imagine that public interest in the Weeks trial waned considerably after the Sarah Schaefer murder. You know, Sarah Schaefer was a beloved teacher, and she was young and vivacious. She just brought a new energy into town, and people, they had seen, the Weeks trial. Obviously, it was a hung jury. Certainly need to move forward to see if these folks were guilty or not guilty and finish that out. And on February the 15th, 1904, Joseph Cora Weeks asked for a change of venue for their second trial. So the second trial wasn't held here in Lawrence County. It was moved over to Jackson County in Brownstown. Cora in particular seemed much happier in the Brownstown jail, out of her old neighborhood. There are reports that she spent her time playing the guitar, the mandolin, and the violin. If I'm not mistaken, John Harris, who was the pauper attorney in Bedford, he was going to represent Mrs. Weeks in the trial. And he's the pauper attorney. Right there. So let's go.
Gotta be like County prosecutor called a number of witnesses who claimed that Mrs. Weeks had stated the intention of blowing the head off of her mother, and, in some of their testimonies, even her husband. A couple named Reynolds claimed that they had seen another couple burning clothing on their fence corner the evening of the murder, and Mr. Reynolds was quite certain that that couple was Mr. and Mrs. Weeks. Fortunately, for me anyway, one witness for the prosecution did mention that Mrs. Ireland had confided to him that she was very unhappy. Even so, I was quite worried for my client, I have to admit.
There was never the slightest reason for my husband to be worried. He's a fine lawyer, and the prosecution never stood a chance.
So I can only assume you're Mrs. Harris?
The very same, Willie Wayne Harris to be exact. Mr. Harris and I have been married for over 10 years, and every day I am so touched by how thoughtful of a lawyer he is and how dedicated he is to his clients, paupers though they may be.
Well, that's very nice to hear, and I assume you can tell us about this second trial?
Oh, of course. It went very well. Witnesses testified that Mrs. Weeks and her mother had a perfect relationship. And the people the Reynolds saw that night weren't the Weeks at all. When Mrs. Trueblood said that she had heard Mrs. Ireland say that she'd rather be dead, Mrs. Weeks broke down and cried. It was so touching.
Is that all?
Oh, not at all. So Mr. Weeks testified that he said Mrs. Ireland seemed very depressed. He said that she could have blown her head off if she had the mind to. Being a seamstress, she was very good with her hands. He said that he and Cora called the doctor within 3 minutes after finding the body, and they never went out into the country at all that night. My husband prepared a masterful case.
Okay, so anxious to know what was the outcome.
The jury deliberated for 2.5 hours and returned the verdict of not guilty for Mrs. Weeks, while Mr. Weeks, his charges were dismissed.
And everyone talked about what a triumph of a case it was for my young, handsome lawyer husband.
Well, we do appreciate your time. Here, we can Thank you for your hard work. So, it's very rare that a murder story ends in a happy ending, but we still don't know whether Susannah Ireland committed suicide or was murdered. But it seemed like at least the Harrises think it worked just fine. So thank you for your time. So Cora and Joseph Weeks left Lawrence County immediately after their second trial. They settled in their native Orange County. For 6 years, after Mrs. Ireland's death, Joseph died of pneumonia at the age of 47. A year later, in May of 1910, Cora married another Orange County man. His name was Laban White. Mr. White also died of pneumonia in Indianapolis at the age of 52. He died January the 30th, 1916. His widow Cora married again 3 days later, February the 2nd, to a man named Jesse Marley. They ended up in Chicago and were in the 1920 census for Chicago. Jesse served on the USS Arkansas during World War I, and he died in 1925. The trail for the three-time widowed Cora Ireland Weeks White Marley goes cold after that, after the death of her third husband. She also outlived her only child, Anna Weeks, who died in Bedford at the age of 12, and of course her mother. So that's all of the story we're going to tell you. We're supposed to head back and see what the paranormal investigators have determined and if they shed any